Welcome to the 2024 NERRS Annual Meeting and to the Gulf of Maine. I'm Paul Dess, Director of the Wells Reserve.
And I'm Corey Riley, the manager of the Great Bay Reserve.
Corey and I are standing on the shores of the Salmon Falls River, whose shores create the boundary between our two states, Maine and New Hampshire. However, rather than divide us, this waterway unites us into the great international watershed called the Gulf of Maine.
The Salmon Falls is one of 60 rivers that empty into the Gulf of Maine, from all the way on Cape Cod, Massachusetts, up to Nova Scotia, Canada. This biologically diverse watershed has been sustaining the people who live here for thousands of years. However, it's not without its challenges, ranging from the impacts of past industry and human use to today's development patterns and the impacts of climate change.
Here to provide an introduction to the Gulf of Maine is climatologist and geoscientist Dr. Cameron Wake, formerly a professor at the University of New Hampshire and currently the director of the University of New England Center for North Atlantic Studies. Cameron?
The Gulf of Maine really has some unique geography and a unique ecosystem. It's often described as a sea within a sea. You can think about it as a sort of a big bathtub. And it's relatively cool water, so even though the Gulf Stream flows offshore, we have the Labrador Current that comes down off of Nova Scotia and sort of takes a big corner around Nova Scotia and serves to really cool these waters. Then we have all these rivers that drain the Appalachians and bring nutrients in. And it's relatively deep in the middle. And that has really created this nutrient-rich ecosystem, which really just has a range of diversity. The Gulf of Maine extends from the sands of Cape Cod in the south through the metropolitan of Boston up through the sandy beaches of New Hampshire and southern Maine, one of those that we see here in Saco, and then up to the cliffs of Acadia National Park, and then around to the rocky shores of Nova Scotia and the Bay of Fundy. It's also, when we think about the Gulf of Maine, we really have to think about the broader watershed that extends into the Appalachian Mountains, which are an old mountain range, hundreds of millions of years old, that form a spine down the eastern part of the northeast US. And there's a huge northern forest, and there's great rivers that actually flow from those mountains down into the Gulf of Maine and supply wonderful nutrients. And here we are in the Saco, which is one of those rivers that's sort of such a critical part of the ecosystem in the Gulf of Maine. And in fact, where we are here right now, where the Saco flows in to the Atlantic Ocean, is a place where indigenous populations have actually come for thousands and thousands of years, ever since the Gulf of Maine really formed. And they were able to live sort of sustainably off of the bounty of the Gulf of Maine. It's also the place of first contact. Samuel Champlain landed here in 1605, and the first permanent European settlement, actually established by Richard Vines, occurred here in 16, 17, and 18. So a really long history of indigenous population here. And then following first contact, you know, Europeans really discovered the bounty of the Gulf of Maine. And that story of Europeans coming to the New World, Europeans coming to the Gulf of Maine, is really not a story of sustainability, but rather it's a story of taking. And so this wonderful and remarkable place of natural beauty and bounty was just seen as something that it was so bountiful that we couldn't ever impact it. So the cod that came from the ocean and the timber that came from the land actually helped build an empire. It helped fuel the American Revolution. Cod in particular made New England very wealthy. And then after centuries of that cod feeding millions of people, we have begun to see the declines in the cod population. And in fact, today, the cod populations in the Gulf of Maine are estimated to be at 1% of what they were during pre-colonial times. So not only have the cod disappeared, but that has resulted in enormous changes within the ecosystem of the Gulf of Maine because cod was such an important predator. So the ecosystem has supported these enormous schools of fish and you know, incredible bounty in terms of lobsters and shrimps and kelp beds, and it's just a really unique and robust ecosystem, and one that really is challenged as a result of not only overfishing from humans, but also as a result of warming in the Gulf of Maine. It's one of the fastest warming bodies of water in the world, and in fact it's warming at 3 times the rate of ocean warming around the globe. And that's causing tremendous change in the species distribution. Not only has that had an impact on cod, which really likes cool bottom waters, especially juveniles, which are warming up, but we've also seen changes in the Maine shrimp fishery, which is now closed down. And we're also seeing the influx of a range of new species, some of them invasive, with the poster child being the green crab. The 2 things that people in the Gulf of Maine talk about, the 3 things that people talk about in the Gulf of Maine is the bounty of lobsters in the northern part of the Gulf of Maine, and that's sort of juxtaposed against the loss of the lobster fishery in the southern part of the Gulf of Maine. The fact that it's warming so quickly, and everybody now realizes that, and the fact that we have these invasive species, with the poster child being the green crab. It's really become a popular storyline. One of the other aspects of the Gulf of Maine that we've seen from the examination of historical climate records is that our precipitation patterns are changing in a big way. We're seeing far more extreme precipitation events, and here I'm talking about storms that drop 4 to 5 to 6 inches of precipitation. They used to happen, you know, once a decade, once every 2 decades, and now we tend to see them every year or every other year. So that's having significant impacts on our communities, which tend to be settled in river valley bottoms. But they're also having really big changes on our ecosystems because we're having these huge freshwater flushes happening much more frequently and much larger. Really important in places like the inland Great Bay, which is a really large inland estuary, which can become much, much fresher with all the freshwater rivers that are flowing into it. But when you think about the cumulative freshwater that's coming from our great rivers, from the Penobscot, from the Kennebec, from the Androscoggin, from the Saco River that you see here, from the Merrimack River that comes down in Massachusetts, it's really challenging these ecosystems. However, there's also some real hope here, is that those ecosystems have actually evolved to be able to live in this place with high variability and salinity. And so as we go forward with climate change, as we see ocean acidification, it's actually these coastal areas in the Gulf of Maine that might provide some real answers on how ecosystems can evolve to these changing and much more variable conditions over time. So again, we see potentially the Gulf of Maine as a model for how other areas in the world might be able to adapt and become more resilient. So another really sort of critical part of this Gulf of Maine ecosystem are the uplands from the shore that extend up to the White Mountains and the mountains of western Maine. And so it supports this incredible northern forest, which has been sort of an integral part of New England's storyline also for thousands and thousands of years. The indigenous peoples often lived inland in the winter and actually migrated here to the coast in the summer to live, and then would return to the inlands. And again, they were able to develop sort of a real sustainable lifestyle within the ship's mast. But we really saw that forest, again, similar to the bounty of what is below the waters in the Gulf of Maine, as something that was ripe for the taking. And we cut it, and we cut it, and we cut it, and eventually over 50% of the forest was cut, and really it resulted in tremendous ecological change on the land. And it's also a wonderful story of resilience. My forester friend that I met up in Bethel, Maine, often would tell to me, he said, well, Cam, you know, Maine soils aren't much good for anything but growing rocks and trees. And I can tell you that is absolutely true, because the New England forest ecosystem has rebounded since the early 1900s. Actually, the cutting of all that forest really led to the development of the Weeks Act, which eventually led to the creation of the national forests. Because when we cut those forests, we damaged all of our waterways, and there was tremendous sediment, there was tremendous fires from all the slash, and we knew that something had to be done. One of the really hopeful aspects, and one of the ways that the Gulf of Maine, I think, can lead other places, is that we're beginning to have those difficult conversations about removing dams. And not only have the conversations, we've begun to move forward. We can see that there's been dam removal on the Squamscott River in Exeter, on the Winnicott that also flows into Great Bay, and then big dam removal on the Kennebec and Penobscot rivers that are now allowing the salmon to make their way back upstream, and other species as well. And I think that there's part of the success story here is that it was a broad collaborative of individuals and institutions that came together. And in this case, there were some really strong Indigenous voices that came to the table and said, you know, those dams have really had significant negative impact on ecosystems for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it's probably one of the most important things we can do to restore those ecosystems is to remove those dams. There was a whole land conservation, land preservation movement that really started up after the big efforts of the federal and state government. So over the course of the past 30 years, sort of led by organizations like the Nature Conservancy, but involving many other organizations, and a lot of them very local, is we've seen this extensive preservation of land, in no small part to actually clean up the water that flows into the ocean. And I think the poster child for this is Great Bay, which now has over 10,000 acres of preserved land and is really helping that ecosystem return. Edible oysters have come back to Great Bay, and there's dozens of different companies that are now growing oysters, and we have big oyster reefs that are helping clean up the water in Great Bay. But that land preservation has occurred sort of all through southern Maine as well, and you know, in no small part, the poster child of these has been the National Estuarine Research Reserves, which are really wonderful examples of what you can experience once you actually preserve land and allow ecosystems to evolve over time. One of the things that really amazes me about the Gulf of Maine is just the enormous set of services that this ecosystem provides us, from food and fiber, to clean air, to clean water, to oxygen, to soil, to spectacular places to recreate, to sort of a place to go and re-nourish and spend time with yourself and your family and your friends. It's a tremendous set of ecosystem services that right now is under considerable stress, both because of development and because of climate change. And yet, within those stresses and within those challenges, we can see all these different examples of ways in which actually we can transition to something that's more sustainable. We can transition to something that really balances taking care of the environment while supporting social needs and also providing economic opportunities for our population. And indeed, I think the Gulf of Maine might be a place where we could pursue that broader notion of sustainability, where we actually have this commitment to the diversity of all people and the protection and preservation of all of these critical ecosystems and ecological places that support us.
Thank you, Cameron, for that wonderful introduction. Corey?
We can't wait to see you in Kennebunkport soon. And we can't wait to welcome you to our Reserves of Field Trip. It's time for you to get ready to reconnect with old friends and make new friends. Read your agenda, come ready to work hard and play hard.
On behalf of Corey and myself and our staff and the rest of the planning team, it's going to be a great meeting. We look forward to having you there, and yeah, goodbye.
I don't know about range expansion.